On the 15th of May 1945, an American targeting committee put a handful of Japanese cities onto a list. By that point, American bombers were already burning out one city after another in the firebombing campaign. But the cities on this list were being saved for something much worse. So the full effects of this new weapon could be measured. You're now going to see the true extent of the horrors of nuclear weapons. Horrors that leaders tried to cover up for decades. So consider this a fair warning before you keep watching. It all started in December 1938 in a chemistry laboratory in Berlin with two men called Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann who were firing neutrons at uranium and then picking through the leftovers. And what they found was barium, which made no sense at all because barium is roughly half the weight of uranium, and nothing in the physics of the time allowed an atom to simply come apart in the middle. They published what they had found without being able to explain it. The explanation came from somebody who wasn't in the room, Lisa Meitner. She had worked alongside Hahn for 30 years and had led that uranium work with him, and she had fled Berlin the previous July because she was Jewish. Over Christmas in Sweden, she worked the problem out with her nephew Otto Frisch. He confirmed it experimentally in January 1939 and gave the thing its name, fission. Now here's why that terrified everybody who understood it. When you burn coal or set off dynamite, you're rearranging the outside of atoms, the electrons, and the energy you get out of that is measured in a few electron volts per reaction. When a uranium atom splits, you're breaking the nucleus itself, and the energy that comes out is around 200 million electron volts. That's tens of millions of times more energy out of one atom. But the energy on its own wasn't the frightening part, because you would need an unimaginable number of atoms to do anything with it, and there's no obvious way to make them all split at once. The frightening part was the second thing that came out. Each splitting atom threw off spare neutrons, and a spare neutron is exactly the thing that makes the next atom split. So you don't have to trigger them one by one. You trigger one, it triggers two, those trigger four, and if you have enough uranium sitting close enough together, that cascade runs through the whole mass in about a millionth of a second. That's a chain reaction, and the physicists who worked it out in early 1939 could see straight away that if anybody ever got it under control, one object small enough to carry could erase a city. And of course, the timing was about as bad as timing gets, since Europe was months away from a war. A lot of the people who understood this best were Jewish physicists who had already been driven out of Germany, and they knew exactly what was still back there. Germany had the finest chemists in the world, an enormous industrial capacity. In 1939, it took over Czechoslovakia, which handed it the Joachimsthal mines and a supply of uranium ore. And then Germany promptly banned uranium exports, which is the sort of thing you only do if you have plans for it. So the refugees started knocking on doors in Washington, and Washington wasn't particularly interested. What finally worked was Leo Szilard writing a letter and getting somebody famous enough to sign it. The letter is dated the 2nd of August 1939, and although the whole world remembers it as Einstein's letter, Szilard drafted it, with Eugene Wigner and Edward Teller helping, and Einstein signed it. It said that extremely powerful bombs of a new type, capable of destroying entire cities, could now be built. It then sat around for 2 months and reached Roosevelt on the 11th of October, about 6 weeks after the war had already started. Einstein, who was a pacifist his entire life, spent the rest of it regretting the letter, and told an interviewer in 1947 that had he known the Germans wouldn't succeed, he would have done nothing. Linus Pauling recorded him calling it the one great mistake of his life. Because here's the thing, the Germans never came close. Their program went down the heavy water road, meaning they needed heavy water to slow the neutrons down in their reactor. And in 1940, that was made at industrial scale in exactly one place on Earth, a plant called Vemork in Norway, which the Germans occupied. So the British and the Norwegians spent the next 16 months taking it apart. There was Operation Grouse in October 1942, then Operation Freshman a month later, which was a glider assault that crashed and whose survivors were executed. Then Gunnicide in February 1943, where Norwegian commandos got into the basement and destroyed around 500 kilograms of heavy water. Then American bombers in November 1943. And finally in February 1944, when the Germans gave up and tried to ship what they had left back to Germany, the Norwegians sank the ferry carrying it across Lake Tinn. But frankly, none of that was the real reason Germany failed. The real reason was that Germany had spent the 1930s throwing its best physicists out of the country for being Jewish, and quite a few of them were now in America working very hard on the other side. So the entire American bomb program, the $2 billion, the secret cities, everything you're about to hear, was built to beat an enemy that was never actually in the race. On paper, the American project began on the 13th of August 1942, when the Manhattan Engineer District was formally established, but the date that actually mattered was the 17th of September, when they put General Leslie Groves in charge of it. Groves was an army engineer who had been running the construction of the Pentagon. He was ruthless with bureaucracy and even more ruthless with deadlines. And within days of taking command, he had secured the highest procurement priority in the country and bought the land in Tennessee. He also picked the place in the New Mexico desert where the thing would actually be designed, a boys' school on a mesa called Los Alamos. Now, when people hear the words Manhattan Project, what they picture is a room of geniuses at a blackboard. Oppenheimer, Fermi, Teller, Bohr, Lawrence. And all of that's true, but it's a tiny fraction of what this actually was. They built 3 entire cities from nothing, cities that appeared on no map. Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee where uranium was enriched, and Hanford in Washington state where plutonium was made. At peak, they had somewhere around 125,000 people working on it. And if you count everyone hired across the whole life of the project, it comes to about 600,000, the overwhelming majority of whom had no idea what they were building. It cost around $2 billion in 1945 money, which is roughly $30 billion today. The secrecy was so complete that the Vice President of the United States didn't know the project existed. That Vice President was Truman, and he only got the full briefing on the 25th of April, 1945, 13 days after he became president. So the man history remembers as the one who decided all this found out it existed 13 days into the job, by which time it was most of the way built. Over 80% of that money didn't go into physics at all, and manpower ran at about the same proportion. The money went into producing a few kilograms of 2 rare materials, because the hard part was never working out how a bomb would function. The hard part was uranium-235 and plutonium-239. Natural uranium is almost entirely uranium-238, which won't sustain a chain reaction, and only about 0.7% of it is uranium-235, which will. Those two are chemically identical and differ in weight by only about 1%, so you can't separate them with chemistry. You have to separate them physically, atom by atom, on a difference of 1% at industrial scale. That's what Oak Ridge was for, and at its best, the main plant there was turning out around 30 kilograms of uranium-235 a month, when a single bomb needed more than 60. Plutonium was the other route, made by putting uranium in a reactor at Hanford and letting it absorb neutrons until it turned into something else. Neither one of those was a laboratory problem. And out of that came 2 completely different weapons for a reason that's worth understanding properly. It's why the 2 cities were destroyed in different ways. The uranium bomb was almost embarrassingly simple. You take your uranium-235 and you split it into 2 lumps, each of them too small on its own to sustain a chain reaction, and you put them at opposite ends of a gun barrel. When you want the bomb to go off, you fire one into the other. In Little Boy, that meant a hollow projectile of 38.5 kilograms fired down a smooth bore gun barrel at about 1,000 feet per second into a target insert of just under 26 kilograms, 64 kilograms of uranium in total, around 80% enriched. They slam together, they're now one lump big enough to go critical, and the chain reaction runs. That's the entire mechanism. It's a cannon that shoots uranium at uranium. It was so straightforward that they never tested it, not once. The first time a gun-type uranium bomb was ever fired in the history of the world was over a Japanese city on a Monday morning. Partly that was confidence, because the design is hard to get wrong, but mostly it was arithmetic, because at 30 kilograms a month, they simply didn't have enough uranium to spend a whole bomb's worth on finding out. The plutonium bomb was a different animal entirely, and the reason was a contaminant. When you breed plutonium in a reactor, you don't get pure plutonium-239, you also get plutonium-240, and plutonium-240 has an unpleasant habit of splitting spontaneously without anybody asking it to. Now put that inside a gun-type bomb. Your projectile is crossing that barrel at 1,000 feet per second, which sounds fast, but the assembly still takes about 1,000th of a second. And in that window, one of those plutonium-240 atoms will almost certainly split on its own and start the chain reaction early while the 2 pieces are still coming together. The reaction begins in a barely critical mass. The energy blows the bomb apart before the cascade has properly developed, and you get maybe 100th of the yield you designed for. In the trade that's called pre-detonation, everyone else calls it a fizzle. You would have spent years and a fortune making the plutonium, and you would have got a very expensive, dirty firework. So the only way to use plutonium was to stop giving it time to misbehave, which meant assembling it not in a thousandth of a second, but in a millionth. And the only thing that moves that fast is high explosive. The solution was to build a sphere of explosive around a plutonium core and detonate that sphere inward. Instead of blowing the core apart, the blast crushes it, squeezing it to a density where it goes critical instantly, and the reaction completes before anything can fly apart. That's implosion, and on paper it's elegant, and in practice it's close to impossible, because an explosion naturally pushes outward in all directions, and you need this one to push perfectly inward, evenly, everywhere at once. If one side arrives before the other, the core squirts out sideways, and you have your fizzle again. What they came up with was 32 shaped charges, explosive lenses, each one machined to within a fraction of a millimeter, arranged around the core on the faces of a truncated icosahedron, which is the shape of a traditional football. Every one of those 32 had to fire within about a millionth of a second of the others. Nobody had ever built a detonator that precise, so they had to invent one of those two. And nobody, including the men who designed it, was confident that it would actually work, which is why, unlike the uranium bomb, this one was going to have to be tested. Now, on the 8th of May, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. And that, if you follow the logic that started this whole thing, should have been the end of it. The bomb existed because Hitler might get one first. Hitler was now dead in a bunker, Germany was occupied, and neither bomb was finished. The reason had expired before the product shipped. Nobody in Washington seriously proposed stopping. The machine had been built, it had cost $2 billion, it employed 125,000 people, and Japan hadn't surrendered. So the weapon simply changed targets on its way out of the factory. And around the same time, a committee sat down to decide where it would go. This is the list I mentioned at the start, and now you get to see what it actually was. The target committee met on the 10th and 11th of May and set out what it wanted. First, an important target in a large urban area more than 3 miles across, because if the city is smaller than the destructive radius, then you're wasting the bomb. Second, some military or war industrial value. Third, psychological significance to the Japanese, so that losing the city would land as a message and not just as damage. And fourth, and this is the one, the target had to be undamaged by previous bombing, because you can't measure what a new weapon does to a city if somebody has already flattened the city. So on the 15th of May, Hiroshima, Kyoto, and Niigata were placed on a reserved list, with Kokura added at the end of June, and American bombers were ordered to leave them alone. While the rest of Japan burned, these places were left in good condition. Their factories kept running, their trams kept running, and the people in them kept going to work every morning, not knowing what the quiet meant. Nothing was falling on those cities because they had been selected as clean instruments. The Americans wanted a before and an after. You can't have an after without a before. Now, I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like the men in that room were cackling. They were not. They were doing what a weapons program does, which is trying to find out what its weapon does, and the minutes read like the minutes of any technical meeting anywhere. That's more or less the point. The decision to preserve 4 cities so that 100,000 people could be killed in a measurable way was taken in the tone of an engineering review, and everyone in the room could sleep afterwards. There was one exception to all of this, and it's worth knowing about. Kyoto was the committee's #1 target, the largest of the reserved cities, and the most psychologically significant. The reason Kyoto isn't on the list, you know, is that the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, personally took it off. He told Groves on the 30th of May that he didn't want Kyoto bombed. And when Groves kept trying to put it back, Stimson went over his head and got Truman to confirm the removal at Potsdam on the 24th of July. Stimson knew what Kyoto was, the old imperial capital, 1,000 years of temples and shrines, and he judged that destroying it would poison relations with Japan for generations. So Kyoto came off the list. And in late July, on the 24th or 25th, a 4th name was written in by hand at the bottom of the list to replace it. That name was Nagasaki. Keep that in mind, because we're going to watch what that substitution costs. Nagasaki had been on an earlier list back in April, and had been taken off in May for 2 reasons. One was the terrain, since Nagasaki is a city of steep valleys and hills get in the way of a blast wave, which makes for a poor demonstration and a poor measurement. The other reason was the Allied prisoner of war camp there. Both objections were true in July as well. Nagasaki went back on the list anyway, in 4th and last place, because Kyoto had left a hole and something had to fill it. it. Meanwhile, the planners had a problem they had made for themselves. By the summer of 1945, they were struggling to find large Japanese cities that hadn't already been wrecked. 6 of the biggest had been burned out by incendiary raids that between them had killed several 100,000 civilians. The Tokyo raid in March had done 100,000 of those in a single night. So the atomic targeting problem was partly a shortage problem, and the reserved list was the solution to it. Save 4, burn everything else. And while this was being organized, some of the men who had built the thing were trying to put a condition on it. 70 scientists, most of them at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, signed a petition dated the 17th of July, 1945. The petition asked the president not to use the bomb on Japan without first describing the terms and giving them a chance to surrender knowing what was coming. It was organized by Leo Szilard, the same man who had drafted the letter to Roosevelt 6 years earlier that started all of this, which tells you something about how the 6 years had gone for him. The petition never reached Truman, it went up the chain and stopped, and it stayed classified until 1961, 16 years after the war ended, and long after everybody who signed it was past caring. Groves, for his part, spent some of that summer trying to build an Espionage Act case against Szilard, which went nowhere, but the attempt is on the record. So the men who understood the weapon best had asked for a warning and had been filed. Which brings us to the 16th of July, 1945, and a stretch of New Mexico desert about 35 miles from the nearest small town. They put the plutonium device on top of a 100-foot steel tower, and the night before the test, nobody in that camp could have told you what was about to happen, not whether it would work at all, not how big it would be if it did. The betting pool ran from a complete dud all the way up, and the general expectation among the scientists was that it would underperform. There was also a quieter worry sitting underneath the arithmetic. This energy source might behave in some way nobody had modeled, and the number could come out far larger than any of them had calculated. That fear was small, it was not 0. At 29 minutes and 45 seconds past 5 in the morning, they found out. The flash was seen from over 200 miles away. The shockwave broke windows in a town 50 miles away. The steel tower didn't fall over, it ceased to exist. The fireball climbed tens of thousands of feet, and the yield came in at around 21 kilotons, which was far above what most of them had expected. And the desert sand directly underneath had been fused by the heat into a sheet of pale green radioactive glass, a substance that had never existed before that morning, and which they named Trinitite. Oppenheimer said afterwards that the line that came to him was from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," and added that he supposed they all thought that one way or another. Whether he said it at the time or assembled it later is one of those things nobody can settle. But the sentiment wasn't unusual in that camp that morning. The thing worked, and the men who built it were astonished and frightened in roughly equal measure. Now we're told that Trinity was fired in an empty desert, and that's where I want to stop for a moment, because the desert wasn't empty. Tens of thousands of civilians lived in the towns and on the ranches downwind of that tower. Not one of them was warned beforehand or evacuated afterwards. When the sky lit up and the ground shook and people came out of their houses wanting to know what had happened, the army told them that an ammunition magazine had accidentally gone up, that it had contained high explosives and pyrotechnics, that there was nothing to worry about. And then the ash came down. For days afterwards, a fine pale material drifted across the countryside and settled on everything. On the grass the cattle were eating, on the open water tanks that families drank from, on kitchen tables and windowsills. The cattle that stood in it were burned and discolored in patches, which the government knew about because it quietly bought some of those animals to study them. Children in those towns went outside and found what looked like snow in July, and they played in it. Some of them put it in their mouths, because that's what children do with a thing they have never seen before. Now I have to be honest with you about where the evidence stands here, because this is a live argument and I'm not going to pretend it's settled. Livestock deaths are documented. The claim that infant mortality spiked in New Mexico that year rests on reanalyses of 1945 data that other researchers dispute. When the National Cancer Institute finally did a full-dose reconstruction and published it in 2020, it projected several hundred radiation-attributable cancers from Trinity, with an upper bound of about 1,000. It also concluded that most of the cancers in those communities were unrelated. Several hundred isn't nothing, and nothing is what the government maintained for the better part of 80 years. New Mexico downwinders were finally made eligible for federal compensation in July 2025, 80 years after the fact, by which time most of the people it was meant to help were dead. So before a single bomb was ever dropped on anybody, this weapon had already produced its first civilian casualties, and the only thing the army ever told those families was that an ammunition magazine had gone up. That's the pattern. Hold on to it, because you're going to see it again, and next time it'll be at a scale that makes New Mexico look like a rehearsal. So that's the weapon. Now let's look at what it was going to be used on, because the state of Japan in the summer of 1945 isn't what most people imagine. Japan had already lost. Not in the sense of being close to losing, in the sense of having no remaining means to continue. The merchant fleet was at the bottom of the Pacific, and the blockade was total. And a country that imports its raw materials had no coal, no petrol, no rubber, and no rice. Industry had been systematically bombed out, and the supply lines that would have fed the factories were cut. The Philippines were gone. Burma was gone, Borneo was gone, Iwo Jima and Okinawa had fallen. The Navy was finished, the Air Force had lost its best aircraft and most of its trained pilots, and the infantry was short of weapons. Filling out its ranks with conscripts, nobody had time to train properly. The population was on starvation rations and had been bombed for months. One young man wrote in that summer that most people no longer believed in victory, and that if they didn't believe, then there was no way they could win, and plenty of the leadership knew it. The problem was that knowing you have lost and being able to say so out loud are two very different things. The ministers couldn't accept the shame and the risk of an unconditional surrender. The military wouldn't consider surrender at all. And the one man whose word was law, the emperor, said nothing for month after month while his country burned. General Tojo, the face of wartime Japan, wasn't running anything by this point. He had resigned in July 1944 after Saipan fell. The prime minister for the whole of this story is Admiral Suzuki Kantaro, who took office in April 1945. Now, the Japanese military did have a plan, and it wasn't a plan to win. It was a plan to make the invasion so expensive that the Americans would rather negotiate than continue, which meant defending the home islands to the last man. And it meant something quite specific about civilians, which we will come to. The invasion was real and it was scheduled. Operation Downfall, in 2 phases. Olympic, the assault on Kyushu, the 1st of November 1945. Coronet, the assault on the Kanto Plain towards Tokyo, the 1st of March 1946. Together they would have been larger than Normandy, the largest amphibious operation in the history of the world. And this is where I have to take a run at the most repeated number in this entire subject because you have heard it, and it's wrong. You'll have heard that the invasion would have cost 1 million American lives, or 500,000, or 400,000, depending on which version reached you. None of those figures come from any 1945 planning document. What the Joint War Plans Committee actually produced on the 15th of June 1945 was an estimate of 193,500 total battle casualties for both phases of the invasion combined. Around 40,000 of those would be deaths. 6th Army's medical planners working on Kyushu alone came up with roughly 394,000, and that figure covers dead, wounded and missing together. Casualties, not deaths. And that, I'd bet, is where the famous 400,000 dead came from. Somebody reading a casualty projection and turning it into a body count, and then everybody repeating it for 80 years. The historian Barton Bernstein went looking for a contemporaneous document supporting the enormous death tolls Truman quoted after the war, the 500,000 lives. He couldn't find one. That doesn't make the invasion cheap. 200,000 casualties is a catastrophe by any standard, and Okinawa had just shown everyone what that kind of fighting looked like. But there's a difference between a terrible number and an invented one, and the invented one has been doing a lot of work in this argument for a very long time. On the 26th of July, the Potsdam Declaration was issued by the United States, Britain, and China, demanding unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union didn't sign it because it was still formally neutral towards Japan, which is a detail we will need shortly. Suzuki's response 2 days later used a word that has generated 80 years of argument, mokusatsu, which literally means to kill with silence, and can be read as no comment or as treating something with contempt. There's a school of thought that says this was a translation accident that cost 2 cities. Most historians now think the Allies read it about right, and that it was a rejection. Then the order, the image everybody carries, is Truman sitting at a desk signing a piece of paper that erases a city. He never signed one. The authorizing order was issued on the 25th of July, 1945, the day before the Potsdam Declaration was even published, by General Thomas Handy, the acting Army Chief of Staff, to General Karl Spaatz. It directed the 509th Composite Group, an outfit on Tinian with its own modified B-29s that nobody else on the island was allowed to ask about. They were to deliver the first special bomb as soon as weather permitted after about the 3rd of August, on one of 4 targets: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, or Nagasaki, and they were to deliver additional bombs as soon as those were made ready. Note the plural, not one bomb with a decision to follow. Additional bombs as they become available, standing authority, no further approval required. Truman's famous note of the 31st of July, release when ready but not sooner than August the 2nd, was about when to publish the announcement. So the machine had been switched on, and after that, nothing more was needed from Washington. The parts were already moving. The cruiser USS Indianapolis had delivered the Little Boy gun assembly and about half of America's entire supply of uranium-235 to the island of Tinian on the 26th of July. The plutonium core for the second bomb came separately by transport aircraft 2 days later. Tinian is 1,500 miles south of Japan, and on it sat the 509th. On the 1st of August, the assembly team, Project Alberta, under Navy Captain William Parsons, began putting Little Boy together. They checked every bolt, wire, and charge, and then checked them again, because there was exactly one of these bombs and no second attempt. On the 2nd of August, the commanders sat down with the reconnaissance and the weather. A single aircraft would carry it, with 2 others alongside, one to measure and one to photograph. On the 5th of August, at Northfield, Colonel Paul Tibbets gave his crews their orders, and the weather over Hiroshima was forecast clear. At 2:45 on the morning of the 6th of August 1945, a B-29 sat at the end of the runway at Northfield on Tinian, with a 9,700-pound uranium bomb in its belly and 12 men aboard. 11 were the normal crew. The 12th was a young assistant weaponeer called Morris Jepson, and he was there because the bomb wasn't yet armed. The aircraft commander was Colonel Paul Tibbets, and the plane had his mother's name painted on the nose, Enola. Before boarding, the crew were issued cyanide tablets. Nobody discussed what they were for. Everybody understood. If the aircraft went down over Japan and they were taken alive, carrying what they were carrying, there was one acceptable outcome. 3 weather aircraft had gone ahead of them, one to each of the cities on the list for that morning. Straight flush to Hiroshima, Jabet III to Kokura, full house to Nagasaki. Their entire job was to look at the sky and report, because this bomb had to be dropped visually. 2 more aircraft flew with the Enola Gay, the great artiste, carrying instruments to measure the blast and necessary evil to photograph it. Somebody in that unit had a sense of humor, and I'll leave you to decide what you think of it. The overloaded bomber used nearly the whole strip to get off the ground. About 90 minutes out, over the Philippine Sea, Captain William Parsons and Jepson climbed into the bomb bay and worked in a crouch, replacing 3 green safety plugs with 3 red live ones. That was it. The bomb was now armed in the air, and there was no way to make it safe again. Meanwhile, ahead of them, Hiroshima was waking up. It was a Monday, and it was going to be a beautiful day. 350,000 people lived there. The trams were packed. Children were walking to school. At 7:10, the air raid sirens went off, as they did most mornings, and people went where they always went. Then the all clear sounded, and everyone came back out and got on with it. Because Japanese radar had picked up the incoming aircraft, and the regional command center had looked at the signature and read it correctly. 3 aircraft, no formation, no bomber stream. That's a weather flight. That's reconnaissance. That's not a raid. They were right. It was reconnaissance. It was just reconnaissance for something that would arrive 45 minutes after the all clear. And Hiroshima, remember, hadn't been bombed. Everybody in that city knew that other cities had been burned out and theirs hadn't. And after a while, you stop asking why your luck is holding. So at 8:15 in the morning, the trams were running on schedule, the factories were running, radios were playing the morning broadcasts, and thousands of people were walking to work under a clear sky. And the reason nothing had fallen on them that summer, and hadn't for months, was that a targeting committee had put their city on a list. Above them, at 31,000 feet, there was no anti-aircraft fire. A few Japanese fighters were spotted and didn't climb, because fuel was being hoarded for the raids that mattered. There was no alarm and no interception. Major Thomas Ferriby, the bombardier, had the Norden bomb site, and the aiming point was the Ioi Bridge, which is a distinctive T-shape where the river splits. It was chosen for one reason only, that you can see it from 6 miles up. The bomb bay doors opened, the clamps let go. Little Boy fell for 43 seconds. In those 43 seconds, the aircraft turned as hard as a B-29 can turn, 155 degrees in a diving right-hand bank, because the crew had been told that if they were still overhead when it went off, they wouldn't be going home. And the bomb fell towards a bridge and missed it by about 240 meters, which nobody on that aircraft could have known, and which made no practical difference to anybody. It went off almost directly above a small building called the Shima Surgical Clinic, at a height of 1,968 feet, which is 600 meters, at 15 minutes past 8 in the morning. Now, the next part happens in a very specific order, and the order matters because each stage did something different to the people underneath. First, the flash. Not an explosion yet, light. gamma radiation and an enormous pulse of heat, moving outward at the speed of light so they arrive before there's any sound or any wind at all. At the center of that fireball, the temperature runs over 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. The surface of the fireball, within 0.2 of a second, is somewhere around 7,000 degrees. For comparison, the surface of the sun is about 5,500. And where that radiated heat met the ground at the hypocenter, the surface of the city was driven to somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. The flash bleached and discolored every exposed surface it touched. And wherever something stood in the way, a body, a ladder, a valve handle, the surface behind it stayed the color it had always been. That's what the famous shadows of Hiroshima actually are. They aren't people burned into stone. They're the absence of bleaching on the stone that a person happened to be blocking. The best-known one, on the steps of the Sumitomo Bank 260 meters from the hypocenter, is the outline of somebody who had sat down there and was still sitting when the light arrived. And while we're here, let me deal with the thing you have heard 1,000 times, that the people closest in were vaporized. They were not, and the physics does not allow it. Masaharu Hoshi, a radiation physicist at Hiroshima University, has put it about as plainly as anyone could, that a body can't simply vanish at high temperature, because ashes are bound to remain. What actually happened to the people nearest the hypocenter is that they were carbonized where they stood. And then what came next took what was left and scattered it, or consumed it, so that nothing identifiable remained to be found. The distinction sounds academic. It is not, because vaporized makes it sound clean, and instant, and almost tidy, like the person was simply subtracted from the world, and what actually happened to them was neither clean nor tidy. Second, the blast. Behind the light comes the pressure wave, moving faster than sound. At the hypocenter, the wind reached 440 meters per second, which is about 985 miles an hour. Nothing built by people stands up in that. Everything inside roughly half a mile was flattened outright, and everything out to 1.25 miles was wrecked or burned to the ground. About 13 square kilometers of the city ceased to be a city. Roughly 69% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed, with another 6 or 7% damaged. Third, the fire. The blast wave passed and left a city of broken timber and paper and charcoal, with every stove and every furnace in it overturned. And within minutes, the separate fires had joined into one rolling firestorm across the center. The cloud climbed to somewhere between 40 and 45,000 feet. And in the ruins afterwards, people found watches, pocket watches, wall clocks, wrist watches in the rubble and on the dead, all stopped at the same moment, 8:15. Some of them are in the Peace Memorial Museum today, and there's something about a stopped watch that gets through when the numbers don't, because everybody has looked at a watch at 8:15 in the morning on the way to work. So that's what happened to the city. Now let's go down to street level, because this is where the story actually is. And because for about 3 hours that morning, there was a bridge in Hiroshima where you could stand and watch the whole thing arrive. The first thing survivors describe isn't fire, it's darkness. The blast threw so much dust and debris into the air that the morning went black. Men who had been walking to work in bright sunshine found they couldn't see 100 meters in front of them. One man said afterwards that it was so dark he could barely make out his wife's face, though she was standing right beside him holding his hand. That was how he knew that neither of them had been killed. And then there were the burns, and I need to explain what kind of burns these were, because they aren't like anything else. An ordinary burn happens because something hot touches you. These happened because a pulse of radiated heat crossed a mile or two of open air and struck bare skin. It absorbed the heat and cooked from the outside in, all in a fraction of a second before anybody could flinch or turn away. It was August, it was already hot, and people were dressed for a summer morning with their arms and faces uncovered, so most of the exposed skin in that city took the full dose. Hair frizzed and burned off. The skin was destroyed to a great depth. Blisters formed almost immediately and then burst, and what was left underneath was raw tissue with the nerve endings sitting in open air. A surgeon who has studied the photographs said the pain would have been about the worst pain a human being can experience. Clothing mattered enormously, which is why the survivors describe things that sound impossible. Dark cloth absorbed the heat and light cloth reflected it, so women turned up at aid stations with the striped pattern of their kimono burned into their shoulders and backs, the dark stripes seared into the skin, and the pale stripes untouched. And then there's the detail everybody who was there mentions, and which took the witnesses a while to understand. People were walking with their arms held out in front of them, and what appeared to be hanging off them in strips wasn't clothing. One survivor said he kept wondering why their clothes were hanging like that, and only found out at the hospital. It was their skin. It had come off in sheets and was hanging from their hands, turned inside out, with fluid running off it. One witness compared it to what happens when you grill a fish and the skin shrinks back off the flesh. Now, the photographs. One man photographed Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945, and his name was Yoshito Matsushige. He was 32, a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun, and when the bomb went off, he was less than 2 miles away, at home with his pregnant wife, finishing breakfast. The blast tore a hole through both floors of his house. He dug his camera out of the debris and went out. He tried to get to the center of town and couldn't because the streets were blocked with wreckage and bodies, and the heat coming off the fires turned him back. So he went to the Miyuki Bridge, a mile and a half from the hypocenter, right at the edge of where the fires stopped. He stood there for 20 minutes and couldn't press the shutter. He said later, quite plainly, that the scene was so awful, he simply couldn't do it. Eventually, he took one photograph, walked a few steps closer, and took a second, and he said the viewfinder had fogged because he was crying into it. That was around 11 in the morning. Over the whole of that day, he pressed the shutter 7 times. 5 images survived development. 2 of them were taken on that bridge, and all 5 are the only known photographs of Hiroshima from the day it happened. What's in them is a crowd of the wounded, mostly children, sitting and standing on a bridge. And here is what they were doing there. Somebody had brought cooking oil, rapeseed oil, from a kitchen, because that was the folk remedy for a burn and because there was nothing else within reach. In the photograph, you can see the canister on the ground and a man in a cap and uniform working through the crowd, a civil defense worker who had been instructed to treat burn cases this way. People were putting their arms into the bucket. There wasn't remotely enough, so when the rapeseed oil ran out, somebody went to the railway depot nearby and came back with sump oil, thick black waste oil drained out of engines, and they used that instead because at least it was oil. People smeared it over themselves and their faces went black. That's the medical response of a modern industrial city, 3 hours after the world's first atomic bombing. A bucket of cooking oil and then a bucket of engine sludge. One of the men on that bridge was called Sunao Tsuboi, and he was 20 years old. He had eaten breakfast with friends and was walking down the street when the light came, 3/4 of a mile from the hypocenter. His face was burned and his back was bleeding. On the way to look for a hospital, he passed a man holding his own intestines in his hands, and another whose eye was hanging out of his head. He gave up on the hospital and went to the bridge. His identity papers had burned, and what worried him, sitting there, was that if he died, nobody would know who he was and his body would never get back to his parents. So he found a stone and he scratched a message into the ground at the west end of the bridge. Tsuboi dies here. He said later that he had thought his life would end at 20 and that it felt lonely. And then he corrected himself and said that futile was probably the better word because they were barely able to move themselves. So what could any of them have done for the people lying on the ground? He was wrong about dying. He lived to 96 and spent most of that life campaigning against nuclear weapons. Now look again at those photographs, because something about them is strange. It's a Monday morning in a city at war, and the bridge is full of 13 and 14-year-olds. And the reason takes us back to something I mentioned earlier, about what the Japanese military planned to do with civilians. Japan was expecting firebomb raids, and the defense against firebombs is fire breaks, wide empty lanes cut through a wooden city so that a fire can't cross. Somebody had to demolish the houses to make those lanes by hand, and the men were at the front, so the work was given to school children, 12, 13, 14 years old, mobilized out of their classrooms and put to work pulling buildings apart with their hands and carrying the stones away. On the morning of the 6th of August, there were about 8,400 of those children at work, out in the open, with no shade and no shelter, clustered along the demolition line that ran through the middle of the city. Most of them were within a kilometer of the point the bomb went off above. Closer in than Tsuboi was, about 6,300 of them died. Among the students who were unshielded and within a kilometer, the death rate was 94%. And a survivor of that work, asked what they had been doing that morning, said that they were doing something that was totally useless. One of the girls who lived was Mitsuko Kochi, 13 years old, in the photographs, in a school uniform with a torn sleeve, bleeding heavily. She hadn't been at the demolition site. She had been requisitioned to work at the Postal Savings Bank. The blast wave hit that building, under a mile out from the hypocenter, at 160 miles an hour, and it blew every window in on top of her and her friends. 6 of them got to the bridge. Her father was there too, badly burned, and when she took hold of his arm to ask if he was all right, the skin came off his hand. And she has carried one thing for the rest of her life. On that bridge, there was a woman with her hair tied up, going round and round in circles, screaming, holding a burned child, and calling its name and telling it to wake up. The child was already dead. Mitsuko was 13 and she didn't help her, and she has thought about that woman every single day since. Now, while all this is happening on the bridge, the Japanese army arrives, and this is the part of the story that I think says the most about what these people were caught between. In a suburb outside the city, an army cadet called Goro Takeuchi saw the light fill the sky and heard a heavy, dull thump. He was 22, and about half an hour later, he set out with 100 other soldiers to help evacuate the wounded. When he got to the Miyuki Bridge, he was given his orders, and the orders were that military personnel had priority. Young men who could still fight went on the trucks first. Women, children, and the elderly were classified as weak, and weak meant they waited. And this wasn't cruelty for its own sake, which somehow makes it worse. Takeuchi explained the reasoning himself quite calmly decades later. Japan was still fighting. Winning required people who could hold a rifle. Women weren't going to be handed rifles. Children couldn't fight. So in a situation where you have too few trucks and too many wounded, the ones with military value go first. He said that when he first received the order, he thought it made sense. He also said that standing on that bridge and actually looking at the people he was being told to leave behind brought him to his senses, and that he couldn't do it. And there's one moment on that bridge that he never got rid of. A little girl went up to one of the trucks and asked for help. A soldier shouted at her. One of the men who was there remembered his voice, stern and without any compassion in it, and remembered the girl being frightened by it and starting to cry, and then running off. She was very small. She went back the way she had come, alone, into the middle of the city, which at that point was one continuous fire. Asked what happened to her, he said what everybody who was there says about the people they couldn't help. She died, of course. Adults couldn't survive in there, so what chance did a little girl have? There's one more figure in those photographs. Behind the man with the oil, there's a small boy with a shaved head, standing with his back to the camera. A family in Hiroshima called Kutsuki have never had the slightest doubt about who that is. It's Akira, the brother of Rie Kutsuki's father, and the proof, as far as they're concerned, is the shape of his ears. Akira was at school when it happened. He was on his own, he tried to walk home, he was carried along in the crowd heading for the bridge, and Yoshito Matsushige photographed him there. And he was never seen again. His mother came across the photograph years later and recognized her son from behind. The family has been asking the same question ever since. He is clearly there in the picture. So why did he never come home? That's the thing about 70 or 80,000 people dying in one morning. When that many go at once, you can't find out what happened to any particular one of them, and the record simply stops. Then, about an hour after the detonation, it started to rain. The fireball had punched a hole through the atmosphere and sucked the pulverized city up into it. Ash, soot, dust, unfissioned uranium, and the fission products the bomb had just created. And all of that came back down mixed with water, in drops that were thick and dark and oily, and left stains on everything they touched. This is the black rain. It fell for 1 to 3 hours, depending on where you were standing. And it fell on a population that had been burned, that had lost every water supply in the city, and that was desperate to drink. So they drank it. They caught it in their hands and drank from puddles, and it was intensely radioactive. And nobody had any way of knowing that, because the word radioactive didn't mean anything to a Japanese civilian in August 1945. The rain didn't stay over the ruins, it drifted, and it fell on neighborhoods miles outside the city, on people who hadn't been burned, who hadn't been knocked down, who had heard a bang and seen a cloud, and were otherwise entirely fine, and it poisoned them. When a meteorologist named Uda mapped the heavy rainfall in 1953, he drew a fairly tight oval to the northwest of the city. When Hiroshima resurveyed it in 2010 with better methods, the real rainfall area came out about 6 times larger than that, which meant that for decades, tens of thousands of people who had been rained on were officially considered not to have been exposed and were therefore not entitled to anything. The recognized zone was finally expanded in 2021 and 2022, 76 years to admit how far the rain had gone. By nightfall on the 6th of August, the survivors who could still walk had crawled out to the edges of the city, and behind them the hills around Hiroshima were lit orange from underneath, because the middle of it was still burning. Japan didn't surrender. 2 days went by, and on the 8th of August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and at 1 minute past midnight on the 9th, the Red Army came over the Manchurian border. Now remember, I said the Soviets hadn't signed the Potsdam Ultimatum because they were still formally neutral towards Japan. That neutrality was the last card Tokyo had. Through the spring and summer, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had been quietly working Moscow, trying to get Stalin to broker some kind of negotiated end to the war on terms better than unconditional surrender. It was never a realistic hope, since Stalin had promised at Yalta to attack Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, and was simply running the clock. But it was the only diplomatic option Japan had left. On the 8th of August, that card was taken off the table by the country holding it. And on the morning of the 9th, a second B-29 took off from Tinian. Now, if the Hiroshima mission was a textbook operation that went more or less to plan, this one was the opposite from the moment it started. And the way it unraveled is worth going through, because the city that ended up underneath it had almost nothing to do with anybody's intentions. Bockscar lifted off at 13 minutes to 4 in the morning, with a fault they already knew about. A fuel transfer pump had stuck, so 640 gallons sat in a reserve tank that couldn't be used, adding weight. They flew anyway. Then they went to the rendezvous point over Yakushima to meet their 2 escorts, and only one of them turned up. The camera aircraft, Big Stink, never found the rendezvous, so they circled. And they circled. For something like 45 minutes, they orbited a point in the sky, burning the fuel they already couldn't spare, waiting for an aeroplane whose entire job was to take photographs. Eventually, they gave up and went on without it. The primary target was Kokura, and when they got there, they couldn't see it. There had been a large American firebombing raid on a neighboring city the night before. It had drifted, and roughly 70% of the target was underneath the smoke. Now, the rules said this bomb had to be dropped visually on the aiming point, seen with human eyes through a bomb sight. So they ran the bomb run. It failed. They came round and ran it again. Failed. They ran it a third time. 50 minutes over a Japanese city in daylight, going round and round. By the third pass, anti-aircraft fire was starting to reach them, and they were being told that fighters were climbing to intercept. And the fuel was now critical. So they left. Kokura had been on the reserved list since June, kept off the target maps and preserved for exactly this. And it was saved by industrial smoke from somebody else's air raid. There's a phrase in Japanese, Kokura's luck, which came into use afterwards, meaning good fortune you only find out about later. They turned for the secondary target, and the secondary target was Nagasaki, which was on that list because Henry Stimson had taken Kyoto off it 2 weeks earlier, and something had to go in the empty slot. Nagasaki was also under cloud. By now, Bockscar had fuel for 1 pass and barely enough to reach a friendly runway afterwards, so there was no going round again. They committed, and through a break in the cloud, the bombardier saw a sports stadium in the northern part of the city, well away from where he was supposed to be aiming. He took it because it was that or carry the bomb home. Fat Man went off at 2 minutes past 11 at about 500 meters, some 3 kilometers from the intended aiming point, over the Urukami Valley. It was the plutonium bomb, the complicated one, the one they had tested, and it was more powerful than Hiroshima's, around 21 kilotons. And the geography that had got Nagasaki taken off the list in the first place is the same geography that saved most of it. The valley walls held the blast in. Everything in the Urukami Valley was destroyed, and people on the far side of the ridge were, in places, barely touched at all. One cameraman who saw both cities put it simply, that in Nagasaki, anything in the valley was gone, and anything over the hill wasn't even damaged. Whereas Hiroshima is flat, so there was nothing to stop it, and it just spread out like a tide. About 35 to 40,000 people died in Nagasaki that day. By the end of the year, the number was somewhere between 60 and 80,000. Among the dead were at least 8 Allied prisoners of war, in a camp that was one of the reasons Nagasaki had been taken off the list back in May, and 1.5 to 2,000 Korean forced laborers, at the low end of the estimates. Bockscar landed at Yontan on Okinawa with its tanks essentially empty. Now, the 9th of August. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War met in Tokyo that morning at about 10:30. It had been convened because of the Soviet declaration of war. The news that a second atomic bomb had destroyed Nagasaki reached the room later that morning, while the meeting was already sitting. I'll leave that fact there without leaning on it, because historians have been arguing about what it means for 60 years, and the argument isn't settled. Some, Tsuyoshi Hasegawa being the best known, read the sequence and conclude that the Soviet entry was what actually broke the deadlock. Others, Richard Frank among them, argue the bombs were decisive. What's not in dispute is that Japan had absorbed Hiroshima for 3 days without moving, and that on the 9th of August it received 2 catastrophes in one morning and finally moved. The emperor came down on the side of surrender. The reasoning that survives in the records is mostly about the survival of the dynasty rather than the suffering of his people. Surrender to the Americans was survivable for the throne. Surrender to the Soviet Union was not. On the 10th of August, Japan offered a conditional acceptance, with the condition being the emperor. The American reply came back on the 12th. On the 14th, the emperor made the final decision and Japan accepted, and Truman announced it in Washington at 7 in the evening that day. And at noon on the 15th of August, the Japanese people gathered around radios in the street and heard the voice of their emperor for the first time in their lives, telling them to endure the unendurable. The rescript he read out mentioned a new and most cruel bomb. It didn't mention the Soviet Union at all. 2 days later, he issued a separate rescript to his armed forces, and that one cited the Soviet entry explicitly. He told his soldiers one thing and his civilians another, and it's largely his civilian version that the world has been repeating ever since. Around 600 Japanese officers killed themselves at the capitulation, including the war minister, Korechika Anami, who committed seppuku in the early hours of the 15th before the broadcast went out. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September 1945. So, the numbers, and I want to be straight with you about them because you'll see wildly different figures quoted, and there's a reason for that. Hiroshima's own official count is about 140,000 dead by the end of December 1945, with roughly half of those, somewhere between 70 and 80,000, killed on the day itself. The wider accepted range for end of 1945 deaths runs from 90,000 to 166,000. The American survey conducted in 1946 came up with 66,000. Now, why is the gap that big? Because nobody knew how many people were in Hiroshima on the morning of the 6th of August. The pre-bomb population was never firmly established, since the count didn't include the transient workers, the commuters, the military passing through, or the unregistered Korean laborers, of whom there were many. The city's records burned along with the city. Entire families died together, so there was nobody left to report anyone missing. The bodies were cremated in mass pyres because there was no alternative, and later Japanese counts included deaths from radiation that the earlier American surveys had simply not treated as bomb deaths at all. That last one matters, so let me put it plainly. A large part of the disagreement about how many people this weapon killed comes down to an argument about when it stops killing them. Because about 4 days after the bomb, the hospitals started seeing something nobody in Japan had a name for. People who had walked out of the ruins with no burns and no wounds, people who had been lucky, who had been indoors or behind a wall or simply far enough away, began to get sick. It went in a sequence, and the sequence was the same everywhere. First, within hours for the worst exposed, nausea and vomiting. Then a period where they seemed to recover, and this is the cruel part, because for a few days they felt fine. Then the appetite went, then fever and diarrhea, then the hair started falling out, in handfuls. Then small purple spots appeared under the skin all over the body, and those spots are bleeding. Just bleeding that has nowhere to go. Then the gums began to bleed and the mouth broke down into ulcers and the teeth loosened, and then they bled internally and died, mostly around 3 to 4 weeks after the morning of the 6th of August. The Japanese doctors trying to treat it called it atomic bomb disease, because they had nothing else to call it. Acute radiation syndrome had been seen before 1945 in a handful of laboratory accidents involving a few individuals. Nobody on Earth had ever seen it in a city. Here is what was actually happening to them. Gamma radiation passes straight through a human body, and on the way, it kills the cells that are dividing fastest. In your body, the fastest dividing cells are in your bone marrow, and your bone marrow is where you manufacture blood. So the radiation went through these people in a fraction of a second and destroyed their capacity to make white blood cells and platelets. White blood cells fight infection, and counts that should be around 7,000 fell below 1,000. Platelets make blood clot, and without them, you bleed from everywhere, from your gums, into your skin, into your gut. So they died of infections that a healthy person shrugs off, and of bleeding that wouldn't stop. And the reason they felt fine for those few days is simply that you don't need new blood cells immediately. You need them when the ones you have wear out. The damage was done in the first instant. The dying took 3 weeks to catch up, which means that a great many people in Hiroshima walked around for a week, helping to clear rubble and look for relatives and bury the dead, already fatally injured with no symptoms and no idea. Now, while that was happening, the United States was telling the world that there was no residual radiation in either city, and that Japanese reports to the contrary were exaggeration or propaganda. Remember the ammunition magazine in New Mexico? Same instinct, much larger scale. The occupation brought a press code in September 1945 that controlled what Japanese media could publish, and the censorship machinery ran for years. American scientists arriving with the occupying forces collected the photographs, the medical records, and the tissue samples that Japanese doctors had been gathering since the 6th of August. In November 1946, Truman authorized the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, and it began work in 1947. And the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission didn't treat anybody. That was the policy, and it was explicit. It was a research body. It examined survivors, measured them, recorded them, followed them for years, and provided no medical care. Treating them was held to be outside its mandate, and its critics have said ever since it would have muddied the data. It performed up to 500 autopsies a year. Tissue and remains were shipped to the United States, where over 23,000 specimens stayed until they were finally returned to Japan in 1973. One family in this story went to the commission to recover a father's body and found that he had been preserved in formaldehyde and dissected. So go back to that committee meeting on the 10th of May, and the cities put aside undamaged so the effects could be measured cleanly. This is what that sentence meant in practice. It didn't stop when the bomb went off. The measurement was the point, the city was the instrument, and the survivors were the data set, and they went on being the data set for the rest of their lives. And that's what happened to the uranium bomb that was never tested. It was tested. The test was Hiroshima, and the results were collected carefully by qualified people for decades. There's one more piece of this, which is what happened to the pictures. Japanese newsreel cameramen went into Hiroshima in the weeks after and filmed what was there. When their first reel was screened for the Japanese army on the 12th of August, the army confiscated it on the spot because they were afraid of what it would do to morale. Then the Americans arrived and sealed it for their own reasons. In October, a Japanese cameraman was picked up by American military police at Ground Zero in Nagasaki, which is how the occupation authorities discovered the filming was happening at all. And an order came down from MacArthur's headquarters banning it and seizing the footage. 26,000 feet of it went into American custody. Separately, an American officer called Daniel McGovern, with a young lieutenant named Herbert Sursan, spent 1945 and 1946 shooting the only color film anyone made of those two cities. They filmed the hospitals, they filmed the survivors, and nearly every patient agreed because Sussan told them that if they allowed it, the world would see what had been hidden, and maybe it wouldn't happen again. Many of the people they filmed were dead within weeks. Sussan said afterwards that he had believed, while shooting it, that if people could only see this, it would be the greatest argument for peace the world had ever seen. Around 90,000 feet of that color film was classified top secret in June 1946 and disappeared for over 30 years. Sussan spent most of his adult life trying to get it out. He wrote to the White House in 1950 and was told by a Truman aide that the Air Force had determined the material was too scientific and lacked, quote-unquote, wide public appeal or information value. He went to Edward R. Murrow at CBS, who said he would look into it and then said he couldn't get involved and wouldn't say why. He had lunch with Truman himself, who said he wasn't aware the footage existed and would look into it, and then reported back that apparently it couldn't be declassified. Somebody in the Pentagon eventually told him the plain version. They didn't want those images out because the images showed the effects on men, women, and children at a time when the United States was planning to build a great many more of these weapons. The Japanese crew, incidentally, had been forced to hand over every frame and sign a statement that nothing remained. They kept a set of prints anyway. 4 men were in on it, and they knew they were risking a long sentence in a military prison. They left the film with a cameraman who didn't know what it was, and he hid it in his ceiling, where it sat for 6 years until the occupation ended. Before any of that, though, the Japanese crew's film had been edited under American supervision and delivered, and it had been given a title. It was called The Effects of the Atomic Bomb. The men who shot it hated that title, and one of them explained why, which is the single best line in any of the source material I worked from. To speak of effects, he said, was to say that the bombs had been effective. They hadn't set out to record effects, they had set out to record a disaster. As for the survivors, they got a word of their own, hibakusha, and a pension, and free medical care, and a stigma that followed them for the rest of their lives. People believed hibakusha women would give birth to monsters, and hibakusha men were sterile. So survivors hid it and lied about where they had been in August 1945, and many said nothing for decades to protect their children and grandchildren from it. One of the people in Matsushiga's photographs is alive and identifiable, and has asked not to be named. And in the middle of the ruins, one building kept its shape, the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, 160 meters from the hypocenter. It survived because the blast came almost straight down on it and went past the walls instead of into them. Everyone inside was killed instantly. It's the atomic bomb dome now, and in a city that had been told nothing would grow for 75 years. The first flower that came back in the ash was oleander, which is why oleander is Hiroshima's official flower. So did any of it stop anything? In 1949, the Soviets tested their first bomb, which was a direct copy of the Nagasaki design, built from what their spies had taken out of the Manhattan Project. In 1952, the Americans tested the first true hydrogen bomb, in which a fission bomb, the kind that destroyed those two cities, is used simply as the trigger for a fusion reaction. It yielded 10.4 megatons, which is around 700 Hiroshimas, and it removed the island of Enola from the map, leaving a crater nearly 2 kilometers wide where the island had been. 2 years later, at Castle Bravo, the designers made a mistake about the behavior of lithium in the fuel and got 15 megatons instead of the 6 they had predicted, 1,000 Hiroshimas, from an error in the arithmetic. Fallout came down on the inhabited atolls downwind as fine white ash, and the children there played in it because it looked like snow. 20 of the 29 exposed children on Rongelap later developed thyroid tumors. Children playing in the ash, same as New Mexico in 1945, 9 years later, on the other side of the world, with a weapon 700 times bigger than the one that dusted those New Mexico ranches, and still nobody warned anybody. Then, in 1961, the Soviet Union detonated a bomb of about 50 megatons over the Arctic, roughly 3,300 Hiroshimas. And that was the reduced version because the design called for over 100, and Sakharov had the tamper swapped for lead to halve it. The pressure wave from that one went round the planet 3 times. So in 16 years, the weapon went from something that destroyed a city to something that could destroy a region, and the number of them went from 1 to tens of thousands. And here is the part that I find hardest to get my head around. Every single thing you have heard in this video, the fireball hotter than the sun, the flash that printed shadows onto stone, the black rain, the children on the bridge with cooking oil on their arms, the 6,300 schoolchildren, all of that came from a 15 kiloton bomb. 15. Castle Bravo was 1,000 of those, and most of Castle Bravo was an accident. The last word probably belongs to Herbert Susan, who filmed it and then spent 30 years failing to get anybody to look at it. He eventually developed lymphoma his doctor thought might have come from the time he spent in those cities. He said he would never know whether showing the footage would have made the world any safer because it was buried instead. And he said that when officials talk about a limited nuclear war, they're talking about something that doesn't exist, because what a nuclear war represents is the end of everything. Anyway, that's the story of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of the 80 years of arguing about it since. Thanks for watching all the way through. I know it wasn't an easy one. Check out the other videos on the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.